Okay, so we're going live. So, hello and welcome to Semaphore Uncut, a show where we talk about bleeding edge developer tools, communities, and people behind those tools and communities. My name is Darko, I'm your host today. And yeah, of course, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. With me today, I have Dave Verwer. Dave, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks very much for having me. Happy to be here on the podcast. So I'm as you said, I'm Dave. People probably know me best for iOS Dev Weekly, which is a weekly newsletter that goes out every Friday with a roundup of the week's iOS development news and articles and libraries and code articles. That's probably what people probably know me best for.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's true. And what led you to starting iOS Weekly, and what are your experiences so far with running it?
Sure. So I had been an iOS developer since the platform started. Really, I wrote a couple of Mac applications before iOS came out, so I was familiar with the technologies. But then I kind of jumped in with both feet onto that platform, and then a couple of years later, I was subscribed to something called Ruby Weekly, which is still going now, and it was a very similar style of newsletter, but for the Ruby. I was previous to being a Mac developer, I was a Ruby developer, so that I was happy to stay subscribed to that and still reading it regularly, and I really liked that format of just distilling down the week's information into what should I actually this week. And I looked around for something similar on iOS, and there wasn't anything. And so I decided, well, I wonder if I can do that. And before I knew it, I was doing it. And I remember thinking at the end of putting the first issue together, well, that's done. And then realizing I was going to have to do it all again in the next week. Next week at all. And I thought I was going to struggle to find stuff, but turns out that was never a problem. In fact, the opposite is the problem. There's always too much stuff to link to. And sure enough, almost 8 years later, I'm still doing it every week. So,
yeah, no issues finding new news. Yeah, I understand.
Especially the last couple of weeks, it has been extremely busy times in the iOS development world.
Yeah, we are going to talk about it. Yeah, you mentioned Ruby Weekly. I mean, when we launched Semaphore, it was like almost 7 years ago. It was also like one of the first media that spread the news around it, and even today, still very vibrant. And we heard that people are coming from Ruby Weekly to Semaphore.
Absolutely, Ruby Weekly and all of Peter's other newsletters are still extremely popular and very good quality. He does a great job.
Yeah. True. Okay, and during running the let's say, would you call it a business or yeah,
absolutely. It didn't start that way, and I'm not sure it was ever my intention to turn it into a business, but it's absolutely a business now. Yes. So the primary reason I started it was because I thought I could do a good job at it, which is always a good reason to start something, rather than purely to see it as something that could make money. But there was that element of self-promotion in starting it as well. I thought, I wonder if I can in the iOS community by doing this, and it certainly did. And actually, I resisted sponsorship and turning it into something commercial for quite a while, or at least it felt like quite a while. I guess it was only about 18 months. Mm-hmm. But I started getting approached by companies fairly quickly, interested whether they could place like a sponsored link in the newsletter. And I said no for a little while because I didn't really want to do that. That wasn't why I started it. And then as time went on, I kind of got a little bit nervous that if I then started to take sponsorship, would people then think that was the only reason I was doing it and they would unsubscribe? Actually, when I did start taking sponsorship and turned it into something that made money. The opposite was true. Reached out to me saying, "We're so glad that you're taking sponsorship now because that means that this is going to continue, and we would like it to continue." So it was a very positive reaction to it. But yes, these days it's not my entire business, but it's part of my business. Yeah.
Well, I can say that about ads. That I find ads I'm subscribed to a couple of weeklies. And I kind of like seeing ads in those weeklies. I mean, those are maybe very few places on the internet where I love, kind of seeing, because it's kind of.
And it's also it's really important to make sure the ads are, first of all, good quality. I have had situations where I've had to kind of turn advertisers away because it wasn't maybe a perfect fit for the newsletter or something like that. People are putting their trust in you to provide them with links that are of good quality, and that includes the sponsored link. So it's really important to me that they are very relevant to the audience and also good quality products and services too.
Yeah, true. And when we were preparing for the show a week or so ago, you also mentioned a website that you were running for quite a while.
The one that shut down recently?
That one.
Yes. So it did shut down, but it was a happy reason that it shut down. So the website was called appreviewtimes.com. And back in the early days of the App Store, Review Times, which is where if you put your application on the store, Apple take a look at your application. They don't look at the source code, but they run your application and they run it past some guidelines that they have. And they either approve or reject your application. And in the early days of the App Store, the queue before you got down to a reviewer could be quite long. And actually, more problematic than the length of the queue was the fact that queue could vary wildly from week to week. So sometimes it would be like a week in the queue, and sometimes it would be 3 or 4 weeks in the queue, which, I mean, that was an extreme case. But if you're trying to plan, especially if you're working with clients, telling a client, well, yes, we've finished your application, but nobody can download it until a month later, that doesn't go down very well. I started the website as a way to try and give developers a bit of insight into roughly what the queue length was at the time. And so I crowdsourced the information. I got people to tweet out their review times and hashtag either iOS or Mac review time. And then the website was very, very simple. It just collected that data, truncated the kind of extreme values off the end, and then averaged the rest of the data to give times. And it worked very well for many years. But then in 2016, some changes internally at the App Store meant that I guess things got reprioritized, and suddenly that queue went from a week or two down to a day or two. And it's been very consistent at around about a day for an app review since then. And so the website was really since 2016, but actually in kind of late 2018, 2019, I noticed that because there was so little data coming, could skew that average really easily just with a couple of bad tweets. And because people trusted that website so much, and again, it comes down to that same issue that I was talking about with iOS Dev Weekly. If you provide a service and people put their trust in that service, it's really important for you to respect that trust. And so I decided that rather than just let it kind of languish and give potentially bad data, the best thing to do was just to shut it down weeks ago.
Yeah, it was like this was like an incident running for a couple of years. There is a delay on the queue, and then it went below, and
Yeah, and so at first, like, because Apple are a very secretive company, of course, everyone knows that, and so when the queue time did go down, nobody really knew, is this how it's going to be? And so you don't want to shut it down straight away, because is this just a fluke? Is this just something that's happening temporarily? But over time, it really did become clear that this is the new standard. Around about a day for review is how, and it felt like an intentional change. It wasn't something that happened gradually over time. It fairly quickly dropped. So it felt like an intentional change.
Yeah. So it feels that you get some additional free quality check. I mean, if it's a day, then it's okay. Thank you. You did that. If it's 4 weeks, then please let me live my life. Yeah.
And again, if it's a day, but as long as it's consistent at a day, you can plan for that day. So you can say, okay, well, we need to release on Monday next week. Let's submit it on Wednesday this week just to make sure that the review goes through okay. And that kind of level of planning gives you to schedule releases in good time.
Yeah, predictability is a huge thing. Yeah, there.
Predictability, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, and you mentioned there is just a couple of weeks behind us. There is a developer conference that happened. So maybe you can share your thoughts of what was released and what you are excited about.
Yeah, so it was a fantastic conference. I mean, it always is. It's always a good show. But this year felt like a really big year in terms of just the sheer things that changed and the significance of those things as well. I mean, the big news, I know the audience for this podcast is not entirely iOS developers, so people may not have caught the big news, but effectively a couple of fundamental new technologies were introduced at the conference this year to set what I see as the next kind of 5 to 10 years of iOS development, in the direction for the next 5 to 10 years of iOS development. So we've been using on iOS something called UIKit so far, and UIKit isn't going away, it's still there. But a new technology was introduced called SwiftUI, which sits kind of on top of UIKit, although the technical details of that are not quite as simple as that, and sometimes it doesn't sit on top of UIKit, but you can almost think of it as sitting on top of UIKit. And it's a declarative and reactive development framework rather than an imperative one, which is very much what quite a different change in the way that we work with building iOS apps. It's not released for production yet. It's still it's in beta at the moment. It will be available to ship in probably September this year, which is normally when the new version of iOS comes out. But yeah, quite a big change in terms of iOS development, and very exciting to see how Apple see the next years of this platform going forward.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I saw a lot of news around SwiftUI, and it seems that it's the next thing. I wanted to ask, so speaking a couple of weeks ago with Peter from PSPDF Kit, he mentioned something that was back then called Catalyst, which yes. Since I'm not in these waters very much, was like news to me. But since then I was following the news, and I'm now recognizing. So it was renamed, I think, right, to the Catalyst. Is it the name?
Yes, so it was. Everyone had been referring to it as Marzipan, which was the as allegedly internal code name for it. I think it was fairly widely known that it was Marzipan internally. In fact, they actually made a joke about that, a very subtle joke on stage this year. I was kind of expecting them to mention it in some way, but they mentioned it in such a subtle way. In the session, the conference session that was demonstrating Catalyst, they had a demo application up on the screen on the slides behind, and one of the items, it was like a list of cakes and stuff, and one of the items in the list was marzipan, which I thought was a very, very nice way just to acknowledge that everyone had been calling it marzipan for the last year. But yes, it's a technology to allow you to take an iPad application written with UIKit, which doesn't usually run on the Mac. There is no UIKit on the Mac, or at least until now there hasn't been. And it allows you to create a Mac application out of that. And so to allow that to happen, they have basically brought all those UIKit frameworks across to the Mac specifically for use by Catalyst applications. So you have this ability now to take an iPad app that you're shipping to the store and fairly simply, at least to get a basic version of it going, you can get a version of your iPad app working on the Mac fairly simply. And then, of course, the stage after that is to make it fit better with the Mac. So it will look a little bit like an iPad application running on a Mac to begin with, but they've introduced some additional APIs as well to help you make it fit better with the platform. So take advantage of menus, right-click and bars and things like that.
Yeah, and I mean to rewind a bit, I still remember like Windows 3.11 95, and then struggle to get Linux and Unix a decent UI. And I mean, UI is a difficult thing, to pull through, to be of high quality and detail, and you need guidance there. And there hasn't been so far such a, at least not a successful technology to enable you to do that, right?
To enable you to do kind of cross-platform?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is cross-platform in the most Apple way possible. It's across all the platforms that Apple care about, which is the platform.
Yeah.
Catalyst brings together UIKit and macOS and iOS, but actually SwiftUI is in a different way as well. Like, you can write the same SwiftUI code or using the same framework for actually all of the Apple platforms, iOS, macOS, even TV, Watch, and is that all of them? Oh, and then iPadOS is the new one. They split it slightly. So yeah, I mean, it's always been a good pro with Apple's kind of default stock UI components. UI components tend to be fairly attractive to look at. But if you go down that route of using their standard components, then you're going to have a much easier time when it comes to things like this, where your application needs to work on a different platform. They're going to make those components look more Mac-like on the Mac without much work. If you've gone down the completely custom UI route, then that transition to make. And of course, there's pros and cons to both of those ways of doing things, but you're generally going to have an easier time if you stick with Apple's. Yeah,
sure. Less work for you, and it's covered from their side. Yeah, and in the area of iPad OS, I mean, I think that a lot of people are very excited about it. I'm from the general public, from what I have seen. Any thoughts on that?
iPadOS is interesting. It feels like, obviously tvOS and watchOS and those other platforms, they are all behind the scenes, they're all basically iOS. I believe even like the HomePod is running a version of iOS, although it's not a version that we can do anything with. There's no third-party applications for it. But they're all running iOS. But tvOS and watchOS were definitely like forks from iOS. Like, they are adding features to those platforms that are not making it back into iOS. iPadOS, I think it's unclear at the moment how much of iPadOS is just a kind of marketing thing and how much of it is an actual technical thing. My gut feeling says that actually it's still very much the same code base underneath, and I think that's a sensible way to do it, because you don't want the two platforms going away from each other too much, because they are so similar. They're both touchscreen devices. They're both effectively very roughly the same size of device. Obviously the phone is smaller than the iPad, but they're the same kind of size. That you're going to be able to do very similar things with both of those devices. So it could just be that iPadOS is really just a marketing name on top of the same operating system. But what it does do, and I heard some people talking on a podcast the other day about this, is it promotes the iPad in terms of the importance to Apple. At the moment, iOS is just this one big thing that covers both the phone and the iPad, and splitting it in terms of the marketing of it means that they can actually push iPad specific, and I hope that actually leads to the iPad becoming a more important platform to Apple, because I think it's one of those platforms that's been through. Obviously, all platforms go through changes, but the iPad especially has been through a slightly troubled history in terms of what does the iPad actually do? Is it a machine for work? Is it a machine for media consumption? Is it a machine for... and the truth is it's all of those things, but giving it that separate marketing name, if that's what it is, I think allows them to segment it slightly further away from the phone in terms of how they talk about the iPad, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, it seems like that they, as you said, opened the doors to ship different things to iPad, which they haven't been able to do before. Yeah, I was surprised a couple of years ago. So I'm kind of in the iteration. So I buy iPad every couple of years. In the meantime, you just don't look around, and I know that it was burst of various other tablets.
Yeah.
And I was surprised, maybe it was like at some point last year, I saw a Verge review where it just said, so there is pretty much nothing else that's worth looking at except iPad. It's the thing. And with the Pro and what you can really do with it, with the size, and, I'm seeing architects in the coffee shops, drawing on it and really using it as a tool. It's interesting. I wanted to ask, but you, I think, already answered that. Is it important for consumers to know that it's a different operating system? Like, is the name even does it matter really to the people, to the most of the customers? But
yeah, I think so. Yeah, and the other point that is that now it's got a different marketing name, even for developers, even when talking about it in a developer context. That means that Apple are going to need to address iPad OS as a separate element inside their developer conference every year. Here's what we added to iOS, here's what we added to iPad OS, and that means that the iPad is going to get, well, maybe this is what that means. I would assume that what this means is that iPad is going to need features or improvements every single year, which, like I was saying, that kind of pushes that platform forward independently of iOS as a whole. I think that will be a good thing.
Yeah, we're coming from the very bottom up side of like how they implemented that. Is it a feature flag or operating system? But yeah.
And who knows? We'll never know how they actually technically implemented it. It could be. I mean, I'm assuming that watchOS was forked from iOS. It could be that watchOS is actually still internally the same build. I mean, I'd struggle to see, but that would be a lot of feature flags, right? From everything from the watch to the iPad. But who knows how they organize it internally? The marketing name for it, even the developer marketing name for it, is actually what's important.
Yeah. I mean, from time to time, I'm doing demos of like various features from Semaphore on YouTube and so on, and we are also, on support and so on, talking with customers, and it's very important to have clear terms when you're communicating. So just from a communicational standpoint, it's nice to have this term now, so it's like easier to communicate. I mean, if obviously it's not the same thing as the iOS app.
What'll be interesting now is if maybe next year do they rename iOS to iPhone OS, because the only thing that runs iOS, like pure iOS now, is the iPhone, which I think will be lovely in a way because I think it's super clear. But it will also be a nice return to, like, when the iPhone first came out, there was no iOS, it was iPhone OS to begin with. And so it would be a lovely return back to that. Yeah, exactly. So in some ways, I'm surprised they didn't do that this year. If you're going to have iPad OS, why not have iPhone OS as well? I'm slightly disappointed they didn't just go.
Yeah. I think they have good reasons. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it was great exploring these topics. Are they maybe what are your plans for the next steps? Maybe with the newsletter that you're running, and I think that I saw on your blog that you also recently started. Is it like iOS jobs or?
Yeah, yep. So I have a couple of other projects that are ongoing at the moment. There's iOS Dev Jobs, which is a new site which I started just a few weeks back, just before the conference. Actually, it was like maybe 2 weeks before the conference it launched, which is a way for me to hopefully put people who are looking for iOS jobs in touch with companies, directly in touch with the companies who are looking to hire people. And that's had a good launch so far. It's had over 60 jobs posted and almost 20,000 people kind of clicking through those links to go and see those jobs. So a successful launch. But launching a project like that is always tricky because you need both the people looking at the site and also the companies posting the jobs on the site. And if either one of them isn't there, the whole thing won't work. So it's been a successful launch, but I don't know yet whether it will be a long-term success. But I'm very hopeful for that. I think it stands a good chance of being a long-term success. Certainly the feedback, both from people looking for jobs and also from the companies who are hiring, has been really positive so far. Then another project that I have running at the moment is one that's been going for a little while now, more than a year. I don't remember exactly when I launched it, but it's called the iOS Dev Directory, which is my attempt to kind of map and catalog the community a little bit. So that is a list of everyone I know who blogs about iOS development, and I think there's like 600 or so blogs on there now. I started that site for slightly selfish reasons. It's always difficult for me to keep up with the community. I like to read everything the community is writing so that I can pick what goes into the newsletter every week. And I thought, well, rather than me trying to find all these blogs, let people tell me about their blog, and I'll publish that site containing a link to their blog, and it exports OPML files, which you can bring into an RSS reader, and it allows me to keep a really good track of what's being published in the community, but also the site itself is hopefully a user at the same time.
Yeah. Yes, I mean all the tools that you mentioned are like, it's very nice. They're all taking care of one segment, and it's something that people really need. I mean, when you mentioned directory, I thought that you were going to say to go in a different direction. So when we were beginning, I don't know, it was like 2008-9, working with Rails. You mentioned that you were a Ruby developer previous to becoming iOS developer.
Yep.
Or iPadOS developer, we'll see. There was a working with Rails directory, which was a directory of companies.
Rails, yeah, I remember it.
I don't know if it's still alive.
Yeah.
I haven't checked in a few years.
It's not. It's working with Rails is no longer active. I did go and check because I remember that site when I was a Ruby developer as well, and I think one thing that was nice about that site is that you could kind of put up your own little page and say, like, where to find me, what I do, but then you could also, if I remember rightly, you could put up like what clients you'd work with and like what projects you had and stuff like that. So it was like it was a directory in the same way as the iOS Dev directory is, but you had slightly more control about what went into your listing. The way that directory is slightly slightly simpler than that, but I do have some ideas which I haven't yet decided whether to explore them or not, but I do have some ideas around taking the iOS Dev directory forward a little bit, because the site as it stands at the moment is a useful resource. If you want to find somebody's blog, it's on that site. Like, there's an enormous number of blogs on there, but there's not a lot of reason to actually go and visit that site because all it is a list of blogs. So I'm considering whether to start actually pulling in links to some of the actual content, and to make it somewhere where people can go to see not only the list of people who are talking about it, but maybe some of the posts. And of course, not actually importing their content or anything like that, but still just linking out to the site so that it's more of a destination for people to go to rather than just a list of people who are blogging.
Yeah. Sounds like a great feature to me. Because some of those sources of material, some of those blogs, are less frequent or more frequent content, and then from that perspective, I mean, with working with Rails, there was some concept of testimonials, which are I don't remember for what reason, but felt more trustworthy than if you just put something. So there was someone has to register there and kind of verify that. That was a nice thing. Okay. So I would say we are old. Most of the people, starting with Rails now and all that, probably don't remember that. It was like almost 10 years ago or 10 years ago. Yeah.
It's more than 10 years ago. Yeah, it's probably more like 15 years since Rails was in the 0 point something releases, which is when I started with it. I think I started with Rails around. Actually, I remember exactly what got me started with Rails. I was actually working at a .NET job at the time, and I was a little fed up with that technology anyway. Mm-hmm. And I saw the very, very famous video, the David Hannemeyer Hansen video, "Let's Build a Blog," in some ways, that video changed my career, because that got me interested in Rails, and not immediately, but that decision to get interested in Rails meant that I left that company I was working at and started my own business. Started out doing Rails stuff, and eventually, so actually, it all stems from there, because I don't know whether you remember as well, but in that video that he did, the text editor that they used was TextMate.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sure.
And TextMate wasn't the only reason I bought a Mac, but it was one of the reasons I bought a Mac. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that 5-minute "Let's Build a Blog with Rails" video is the reason I am now an iOS developer. It's quite possible.
Yeah. It's. I mean, I was, I was just getting out of the university and all that, and I remember also that component. Okay, so if he's so good and he's using those tools, I should be also using those tools. So it was like an ultimate sales pitch. So, but you also nicely described it.
I mean, that Rails video was incredible at how, it's hard to remember back how web development was when that video came out.
I have some sense. Yeah,
it was a different world, and looking at that, the speed at which he put that thing together, and the way that Rails worked, and the whole kind of convention over configuration, and Ruby having the whole motto of the kind of happiness, the developer is more important than anything else, was such a breath of fresh air, coming from, at the time, a .NET world was very much around web forms, which was not a particularly pleasant technology to work with. And obviously .NET has come on leaps and bounds and is doing there's some amazing .NET things happening now, but it's like how things were at that point, and that video really did influence, I think, a lot of people in terms of the way they were working with the web.
Yeah. I remember one of my impressions was like, is this really possible? Can you do anything with it? Because there are so few lines of code. It means that it's like, some templating thing, which is very, specific.
And of course, that was ultimately the reason they eventually got rid of that scaffold line. It doesn't exist in Rails anymore, because it is kind of inflexible. And what he built was incredible. Yes. For a 5-minute video, but of course, like building a real application, you don't build a real application in 5 minutes, but that doesn't mean that the technology wasn't good. Like it was also built on top of really solid stuff. If I ever need to do any server side stuff now, Rails is still absolutely my go-to choice for that.
Yeah. In 10 years, there was like a burst of like Node.js being very popular and Go being very popular for the backend and all that. But from developer experience perspective, there is nothing even close to it, for what I have seen. Yeah.
I think so. I'm not a Node developer. I don't know much about Node, but I believe Node is extremely popular these days. In fact, I think it's very much taken over from Rails in terms of what people are actually using. But that doesn't mean Rails isn't
Yeah.
still, good. It certainly still has a place in my
Yeah,
heart.
I mean, there is some for the fairness to everyone. I have to say that the new version of Semaphore that we have built, excuse me, launched like 6 months ago. We are using Elixir and Phoenix for the view side. So we jumped that ship of like microservices and communicating.
I hear great things about Elixir, actually.
Yeah, I mean, from that, when I started pronouncing words from the developer perspective, they were not even close. I mean, this is the closest that we have seen. Elixir from the syntax side, but also from the whole developer experience, the tooling, the community, and all that around. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was a fantastic conversation. I hope you also enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope that in future when you start some new projects and we can hear how it's going, so maybe we'll have a chance again in the future to talk. Okay.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been an absolute
Thank
pleasure.
You. The same. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.